Hi class, welcome to Module 5, Video 2 of Music Appreciation Online, the Classical Style. Our initial topic for this video is the first great composer of this period, Joseph Haydn. Haydn is credited with developing many of the genres and characteristics of this style. He was a prolific composer who demonstrated musical talent at an early age. He sang in the boy choir in Vienna, but was dismissed when his voice changed. He continued to study and became the court composer for Prince Esterházy, the Hungarian aristocrat. For nearly 30 years, Haydn was basically a skilled servant for the Esterházy family. He wore a uniform and dined with the other servants. However, he had access to everything a composer could want, an orchestra and a choir. He knew that whatever he composed would be performed. That's a real luxury for a composer. After the prince's death, Haydn moved back to Vienna, where he became quite famous and wealthy from the sale of his works. Haydn is considered to be the father of both the symphony and the string quartet, but he likely was not the first one to write either type of piece. Haydn had a great sense of humor and wrote a large number of works of consistently high quality. Now let's revisit the concerto. We discussed the concerto during the Baroque period and learned that these pieces typically feature one or more solo instruments playing opposite the rest of the orchestra. With the classical style, the concerto grosso disappeared. Composers favored the solo concerto, and the featured instrument of choice was the piano. Concertos for other solo instruments were written for sure, but more concertos were written for piano. We'll discuss a couple of different concertos, one for trumpet and one for piano. The concerto remained a three-movement format: fast, slow, fast, tonic, some other key, and tonic. These pieces really focused on the musical conversation, and there is a lot more alternating between the soloist and the orchestra. The first movement is usually in sonata allegro form, but it features a double exposition. The first exposition is all in the tonic key and acts like a long introduction. During the second exposition, the solo instrument enters and the form is followed as expected with a modulation to another key during the transition. Another main feature of most classical concertos is the cadenza. From the Italian word for cadence, this is a pause toward the end of the first and occasionally the last movement, where the orchestra will play a sustained chord indicated with a fermata in the music. The orchestra cuts off, and this signals the beginning of the cadenza, at which point the solo instrument continues to play unaccompanied. During the cadenza, we usually hear bits and pieces of themes from the concerto, and the soloist usually plays a few technically challenging passages, showing off if you will. These cadenzas were usually improvised in performance, meaning the soloist basically composed the cadenza on the spot. Because these cadenzas were improvised, there had to be some signal to the orchestra that the cadenza was coming to a close. So the soloist would play a long trill which would usually lead into the final few bars of the piece. Later, most of these cadenzas were notated as composers realized most performers were not skilled at improvisation. However, they still usually ended with a trill. For our first example, we'll hear the last movement, Movement 3, of a concerto for trumpet composed by Haydn. Haydn wrote this piece for his friend Anton Weidinger, who was a trumpet player in the court orchestra of Vienna. Weidinger helped to develop a new instrument that he called the Organised Trumpet. It was intended to replace the natural trumpet, which you see pictured here. These instruments were common in the Baroque and were still used through the end of the 18th century. Weidinger basically took a smaller natural trumpet, more like a bugle, and added keys much as you would see on a clarinet or saxophone. The keyed bugle or organized trumpet is pictured here. The keys allowed the trumpet to play all 12 chromatic pitches for the first time. Although the instrument never became popular, it did inspire composers to write more challenging music for the trumpet. Go to the Connect website and listen to the Concerto for Trumpet in E-flat major by Haydn, movement number 3. This is on the list of pieces to know for your next test. There are several recordings of this piece available featuring the solo performed on a keyed trumpet. Now, back to Mozart. Mozart wrote 27 concertos for piano, quite a few by any measure. Of course, Mozart was a brilliant pianist and performed many of these himself. He also wrote several for his royal patrons, and several were composed for his own students. Our example is the Piano Concerto number 23 in A major, movement number 1. In this piece, Mozart shows off the skill of the pianist, but with grace and elegance. This is not a flashy piece. It is lighter in character than many of his other concertos. Of course, Mozart was writing for an earlier version of the piano called the Forte Piano, sometimes called pianoforte. It was smaller than the modern piano and even the instruments that Beethoven played a few years later. The Forte Piano has a lighter, more delicate sound. You can hear examples on YouTube. I have included a link for Matt Bingston's Forte Piano. It is an excellent video that gives some more history of the instrument and compares it to the modern piano and the harpsichord. Now go to Connect and listen to Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23, Movement 1. This is on your list of pieces to know for test number 4. We have already discussed a bit of Mozart's music, but now here's a closer look at Mozart's life. He was born into a musical family. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a court composer and violinist in Salzburg, Austria, the younger Mozart's birthplace. Around the age of 3, Wolfgang Mozart showed interest in the piano, as his older sister had been studying for a while. He quickly demonstrated a natural skill and proved to be a remarkable prodigy. Recognizing his son's talent, Leopold Mozart decided to exploit his son for personal gain. So, a few years later, Leopold took his 2 children on tour around Europe. The young Wolfgang amazed people with his skill and ability to perform tricks at the keyboard. The family started gaining wealth and fame. By the time he was a teenager, Mozart had accomplished a lot as a composer and pianist. Joseph Haydn had taken notice. The young Mozart wrote his first piece at the age of 5, his first symphony at the age of 8. Trust me, 8-year-olds do not write symphonies. And he wrote his first opera by the age of 12. Most 12-year-olds don't have the insight to compose opera, but Mozart did. After trying for several years to attain a position with the Salzburg court, Mozart decided to branch out on his own and get away from the ruling thumb of his demanding father. Mozart married, left Salzburg, and never looked back. He went to Vienna where he became a huge celebrity. Mozart composed in all of the common genres and wrote over 600 compositions. And though he was so prolific, the quality of his works was always very high. He was influenced by Haydn's style, but clearly developed a style of his own. He died shortly before his 36th birthday, and it is interesting to note he died nearly penniless. He is thought to have been a gambler and may have had 1 or 2 mistresses, though he always remained devoted to his wife Constanza. Mozart was so gifted as a composer, it is easy to suggest he might have mastered all of the genres. However, Mozart clearly took opera to a new level. As we discussed earlier, opera developed in the Baroque, but many of the stories revolved around mythology, and the characters were most always serious. Opera was known as opera seria, or serious opera. During the late 18th century, opera evolved into a more subtle art form. It became opera buffa, or comic opera. However, these works still featured serious characters. Mozart, though, may have been the first great musical dramatist. His characters were not caricatures, but real people, many of whom had character flaws for sure. During the changing political climate of the 18th century, Mozart saw opera as his opportunity to poke fun of the aristocrats who were clinging to power. Mozart was able to portray them as unflattering characters in his operas. Our example is one of Mozart's greatest hits, Don Giovanni. It is one of 3 operas that Mozart wrote in Italian, with librettos by Lorenzo da Ponte. Don Giovanni is the Italian version of the story of Don Juan, the famous Spanish lover. Mozart's Don Giovanni is an aristocrat, but one with little respect for those he feels are beneath him, such as his servant, Leporello. The Don is only interested in seducing women, and the opera traces many of his exploits. Leporello is his comic foil, and of course, he wants to be the guy chasing the women. I recommend that you read more about this in your textbook, Chapter 11, in the section on Mozart. Then watch the video excerpts on the Connect website. Finally, we are back to Beethoven. Though we have discussed Beethoven's life, now we will discuss more about his music. First, Beethoven represents a transitional figure as he bridges the classical style with the 19th century Romantic era. Though his early works show the influence of Haydn and Mozart, Beethoven clearly went in his own direction, taking liberties with the tried and true forms and genres. And while for Mozart music was as natural as breathing, for Beethoven it was often a struggle. It was not uncommon for Beethoven to spend weeks or months on a single theme or phrase of music. He was intense and moody, largely brought on by his deafness and volatile relationship with his father. However, Beethoven overcame his deafness and anger to create some phenomenal works of art. Beethoven wrote masterpieces in every genre. To reiterate, while Beethoven did work for several wealthy aristocrats, he made it clear that he was the boss and that no one could tell him what to compose or how to write it. Beethoven is one of the first composers to truly work for his own muse, creating music because he had an organic need to compose. Beethoven is still one of the most revered composers all over the world. In Charles Schulz's Peanuts comic strip, it is a bust of Beethoven on Schroeder's piano. Beethoven's music was included as one of the artifacts sent to Mars on the Voyager spacecraft. Beethoven truly is immortal. We have two more examples by Beethoven. The first is one of his most famous piano sonatas. Remember, the sonata during Beethoven's time had become mainly a work for solo piano in 3 movements. As Beethoven composed many works for aristocratic patrons, this one was for Prince Karl von Lichnowsky. The piano sonata in C minor is subtitled the Pathetique by Beethoven to imply the tragic character of the music. From the slow introduction to movement 1, we hear the emphatic dark minor chords that eventually morph into a brilliant up-tempo sonata allegro. Beethoven follows the form up to the transition, but then puts the second theme in an unexpected key. He seemed to feel as though the rules were meant to be broken. Beethoven continues to play with our emotions throughout, and to prove he's in control, brings back the slow introduction as a way to introduce the development section. Then, as we get through to the recapitulation, just as we're expecting a coda and an ending, Beethoven brings back the slow introduction one last time, then back to the fast tempo to end the first movement. Most of you have probably heard the famous Symphony No. 5 by Beethoven. It opens with the famous 4-note motive that he builds into a theme. The rhythm of the 4-note idea, short, 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 long, is used in all 4 movements of this piece. Many of the same kind of dramatic effects appear in this piece as well. In the opening movement, there are quite a few stops and starts, and some liberties with form. Beethoven snares us one last time at the end of the first movement. Just when we think he is about to end, the coda turns into a second development section, and he even adds a new theme. So Beethoven continues to remind us that he is in control of our emotions. If you really listen, you will hear all of this. Go to the Connect website to hear both of these incredible pieces. You will discover why Beethoven influenced most all of the composers of the 19th century.